Hey, welcome to the live stream Q&A. If you have any writing or storytelling questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. If you're here just to listen to some questions and answers, that's also fine. Looking forward to answering some questions today. Is it bad to write in the first person? I've seen a lot about first person being bad, but I don't know. No, it's absolutely not bad to write in first person. It's not bad to write in any of the perspectives, whether it's first person, second person, third person, limited, omniscient. They all just have different tools to offer you in how you convey that story. And so first person is great for if you want to dig into that character's very unique perspective and immerse the reader in that way of viewing the world. It's also good if that character has a very unique tone of voice that's very fun to engage with, like Dean Koontz's Odd Thomas series. I'm not a big Dean Koontz fan. I've read a number of his works. But I love his Odd Thomas series because the character's voice, the first person voice, is just so engaging. And so first person can be great for that. First person is also great if you want to have an unreliable narrator because we are deeply embedded in this first person perspective and they are a fallible human being. And so you can make use of that. So no, basically, no, it's not bad to use first person, just like it's not bad to use any other point of view. What's bad is if you choose that point of view and then don't do anything with the tools that point of view offers you. And so that's more what you want to focus on, is choose whatever point of view you want, but then look at the tools it offers you and pick them up, make use of them. How do you tell a story with a lot of backstory? I'm confused on what order to tell it. So if you have a lot of backstory in your story that you're trying to convey, the big question I would have you ask yourself is, are you starting the story in the right place? Because if there is a lot of backstories to the point where it's becoming such a problem trying to convey it all, then you might ask yourself, should I actually start at an earlier time in the story? The other things I would tell you, though, if you do think you're starting in the right spot, is that you should consider if a lot of the backstory can be told potentially through parallel timelines. For example, if you have a story that takes place in two different timelines and you're kind of bouncing between the two timelines moving forward, that's a way you can convey a lot of backstory as well, as you can basically have the consistency of, well, we're in the past and then we're in the present, and maybe you're in the future as well for a third timeline if you want to. So that's another way you can incorporate a lot of this backstory if it is a lot. I have a magical themed story right now. How can I make mine unique? The uniqueness of a magic system, for example, often comes from the limitations of that magic system. And this is pretty common advice you'll hear about magic systems because it is kind of the most important, is like, so what limits your magic and what are the boundaries of it? Because that will make it much more unique. For example, if your character can create fire, then you ask questions like, well, where does the fire come from? Well, every time they create fire, what if it drains a little of their life force? Like the fuel of the fire is their life force, and every time they use fire, then they age a little bit. That's definitely something that's a little bit original, and you can use those limitations and the consequences of your magic system to make it not only more unique as a system, but also it can influence the world itself and make the surrounding story more unique. So that's where I would suggest looking, particularly if you want to make use of the magic to make it unique. How do you go about picking a book title? Book titles can come from a lot of different places. Some easy things are, what's a big focal point in your story? For example, is there an object everyone's trying to get? That can be the name of a story. Is there a really important character? That can be the name of the story. For example, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a book. It's just titled after the two main characters. If you have an important place in the story where a big important thing happens, you can name it after that, especially if that place is tied to certain themes in the story. You can take titles from lines you write in the story. If there is like a thematically resonant moment where a character says something, you can pull from that as one potential option for it. And those are some of the ways you can find book titles anyway. Do I have to have the ending figured out when I start writing? You absolutely don't. I personally only like to have a vague idea of how I want it to end. And then I work my way there, and then I get to a point where my characters are going to have a choice, or I have to figure out the details of how it's going to end. And I do that because so much in the story can change, whether it's the characters or how we've progressed towards or how we've progressed the plot. And so I think when you have the ending fully figured out, it can sometimes be limiting, at least for me. So I like to make a decision on how the ending is exactly going to play out. I like to leave that until I'm about to write it. And that, I think, helps me create more organic, surprising, and resonant even endings for my stories. And that's what works best for me. That being said, you can also have the ending figured out and it can still work out. It can sometimes feel a little pre-planned, but you can work around that. Writers like John Irving knows the endings of his stories. He knows the last line of his stories before he starts writing, and he's always just moving towards that ending. Neil Gaiman also, when he was writing Sandman, the comic series, he knew how it was going to end. It was all about driving Sandman towards that ending. So you can make that work, absolutely, if that's the way you prefer to do it. But likewise, on the other side, I do want to make it clear that you don't need to know the ending to start writing, and you don't need to know the exact ending even as you're writing the story. It's fine to just be going in a direction and exploring the story and trying to figure out what the ending might be. So that's totally acceptable. How do I make strategic planning scenes interesting to read? So I'm assuming you're talking about when you have some characters in a room and they're trying to strategically plan how to overcome a problem. Now, a good way to do that is to make sure there's tension in the discussion. Make sure there are different viewpoints within that discussion of how problems should be approached. And maybe have some people who are skeptical of what they can do. A good example of this would actually be if you read the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. Even if you read the first one, Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. It works as a standalone novel, so you don't have to commit to a full series just to read it. But there's definitely a planning scene where the whole plot of it is basically this group of thieves decide to help a rebellion to overthrow this immortal emperor that kind of rules the world. And it's a wild idea that no one thinks is possible, but they have multiple basically planning scenes where they're trying to figure out how to make it happen. And there's skepticism in the discussion. There's different viewpoints within the discussions, and it keeps it pretty engaging as you watch them figure out how to solve this difficult problem. Because that's the main thing you want to have in those scenes. And any scene really is tension. Tension and conflict are what make things interesting, even a strategic planning scene. So I encourage you to check out that book for some ideas. But if nothing else, just think to yourself, how can I add tension to this scene, to this discussion, so that it keeps readers glued to the page? Do you have any advice on developing character dynamics? So how characters interact with each other? A good place to start with figuring out how to have characters interact and how to develop those interactions is to figure out what they agree upon, what they like about each other, but also what they either don't like about each other, or parts of their personality or their goals that can rub against each other. Because what that will do is create tension. And tension in relationships is what pushes people towards change and development. And so it's a really effective way of having relationships evolve. If you want to see just a fantastic way, a story that does a fantastic job of continually developing the relationships and the dynamics of character relationships, watch She-Ra. It does an absolutely fantastic job of not only establishing clear character relationships, but also continually evolving what those relationships look like. Whether it's in the first episode where Adora is initially an enemy to the princesses and the rebellion, but then within a few episodes has joined their side and then become enemy to all the other people on where she came from, the Horde. And the relationship between her and Catra is always evolving throughout the series. I'm blanking on the name of their old mentor, but other characters in the series also it's constantly shifting the relationships between characters. And so you can watch that as a way of doing it, always starting with the tension and then either the resolution of that tension or using that tension between them to drive them to actions that creates more tension. And that's a great way to develop your character dynamics. Any tips for storytelling that has a lot of lore and not trying to drown the readers in flashbacks? I would encourage you, if your story has a lot of lore and you don't want to, like you said, weigh them down with a lot of flashbacks, what you should do is ask yourself, first of all, what actually is necessary backstory and information that they clearly need to know? Figure out what they absolutely need to know, and obviously make sure that that is conveyed. If there's other things that are less important, deprioritize them, because what you're going to want to do is reveal this information gradually throughout the series. You're going to sprinkle it as it becomes relevant. And so if you know what is vital and very important, then you can kind of prioritize those things, because you're going to do world building for your story and you're going to create lore for your story. And it's going to be more than the reader will ever know. You're always going to make more than will ever actually fit in the story. And your job as a writer is to find out what pieces are actually vital for the reader to know. And that's the best way of keeping it from becoming too bloated. To keep it from becoming too bloated is kind of thinking of it like, the iceberg analogy, is you need to create the whole iceberg but you only need to show the tip, because you want the tip of the iceberg to kind of imply the weight of a consistent world and lore beneath it. And so you have to create it all like you have, but like you don't need to tell all the reader. You don't need to tell the reader everything, and you shouldn't tell the reader everything because it doesn't all matter. So that's advice I would give, is to focus on figuring out what the reader actually needs to know from all that you've created, and then only giving them what's necessary. Does every single scene need its own conflict? Can you talk about the anatomy of individual scenes? So I don't know if I can say much about the anatomy of individual scenes, because, well, one, I've never thought too deeply about the full anatomy of a scene, because there's so many different things you can do for a scene that I wouldn't be able to give you, at least off the top of my head, what are the consistent elements of a scene, because they're just so flexible and what you can do is so broad. But I'll focus on the first part of your question. Does every single scene need its own conflict? And it doesn't need conflict in the idea that you need something that, like, a conflict is introduced and then resolved. But what you do generally want in every scene is tension, if you can. It is something that makes tension is what makes readers interested. It's what makes them lean in and keep reading your story when there's tension on the page. And it doesn't have to be big. Like, it doesn't need to be these two people are fighting to the death. It could literally be this woman loves this other woman, but that other woman does not love her back. And there's tension there in the way they're talking. And they both know this. They have discussed this. And they're trying to get through a challenge together. They're trying to hike up a mountain together. And so there's tension in that unsaid but known disconnect of them, of desire from one but no desire from the other one. Like, that kind of tension can be there. Or even just in a conversation, people can want two different things out of that conversation, and that creates tension. Now, is that an absolutely vital part of every scene? Technically, no, but it is what makes readers stay glued to the page. And so it's very good to have in your scenes. And if you can work it into every scene, I do encourage you to do so. How do you make friendships more natural? All my friendship dialogue seems awkward. If you want to make your friendships seem more natural, a key component of that is chemistry, chemistry between the characters. And chemistry is a bit of a hard thing to pin down. People have a lot of kind of loosey-goosey definitions for it. I kind of have my own definition that I think is pretty helpful for creating it. I define chemistry as I define chemistry as a warm connection between two characters that is sharpened by their differences. And so what that basically means is you need to have these characters have something in common, whether it's a mutual interest, a mutual attributes and values, and so they need to have something that they like about each other. But then what you want to do is have differences inside them that creates tension, that creates them to disagree on certain things, that makes them want different things at different times. And what this does is you can see more of a dynamism in their interactions, because you can tell they like each other or even love each other, but they have these differences that create tension and fill the interactions with, like I said, a little more dynamics, a little more movement, and the relationship in some ways can always be in a slight state of flux. And so that's where I think a lot of chemistry comes from between characters. So if you want to create chemistry for your characters, if you want your characters to be more natural around each other, creating chemistry is a great place to start. And I really do, once again, think that comes from giving them something to warmly connect over and then sharpening those interactions with things they don't have in common, disagreements, differences they have. I thought I'd talk a little bit about what I'm currently reading, as I usually like to do, and I'm currently reading Pet Semetary by Stephen King. And the deeper I get into it, I've never read it before. I'm a big Stephen King fan, as I'm sure a lot of you have heard in my TikToks and other live streams if you've been here before. I'm a big Stephen King fan, but I've not read Pet Semetary, which is definitely one of his more iconic ones. And I think if you're someone who struggles with the idea of theme and how to explore theme, I think this is actually a really helpful book to look at, because Stephen King is not very subtle. And in this book in particular, he really definitely goes deep into the theme of death and the way it ripples through our lives, and themes of grief and things like that. And he's not very, like I said, he's a little heavy-handed. And so you can really see how he's exploring the idea of death throughout this story, because each character has different relationships with death. And the events of the story involve death in different ways. And the main character is a doctor who has a very natural understanding of death, which gets challenged in a lot of ways throughout the story. And so, like I said, if you don't really understand theme or how to explore it in a story, Pet Semetary, I think, is a good place to start, just because it is so on the nose which some people might not like, but I think it makes it really helpful to see how an author can explore a theme. Because I think people get confused with themes because they think of them too much as like a thesis statement almost, where it's like an analysis and a message, where in actuality, stories are about exploring different aspects of the human condition and life and experience. And so something like death is explored through experiences, and particularly the experiences of the characters. And so that's something I would recommend if you want a little help with how themes work and stuff like that, is check out Pet Semetary by Stephen King. All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming to today's live stream Q&A. Thank you for your questions. If you want more questions answered, come back again next week at 2 p.m. Central Time should be the time. If not, you'll see in my bio another event you can register for and see if the time is something different. But I hope to see you all again next week. I hope you all have a great week. Talk to you later.